Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for part 2 of my Ships of War episode focusing on the carriers USS Essex and HIJMS Taiho. Now in the previous episode I briefly covered the background and the history of the two ships, so now we're going to get into the meat of the episode and look at how they're represented in the game's Central Pacific campaign. Just a bit of a reminder of the topography of the counters. As you can see, we have a number of stats clustered around the counter. So going clockwise from the top, that is a ship's anti-air rating. That is the anti-surface naval rating. And that is the anti-submarine rate. Oh, wait, no, sorry. This in the middle here is their movement rating. So it's a factor of both their propulsion speed and their range. That's their anti-submarine rating, and that is their anti-ground rating. So it's quite interesting. All of the counters' focus in this game system is about the ship's capabilities. Now you'll note there's nothing about their armor or defensive abilities, and that's because it's sort of left out. In this game system, when a ship takes a hit, it goes into a repair pool, and at the end of the turn, a dice is rolled to see what the fate of the ship is. And of course, the US warships on the whole can bounce back a bit better than their Japanese counterparts can. So I will be comparing the ship's relative survivability, but we will be looking at it in a fairly abstract fashion. So to start with the most obvious one, let's go with the ship's anti-air rating, which is 5 for Essex and 4 for Taiho. Now, I'm going to come straight out and say it. I think the game designers have been overly generous to the Taiho in most of what they've credited her with. I mean, 4 is a pretty powerful factor, and the way combat works in this game is you roll a dice, and if you score the given rating or lower, you inflict a hit. So I'm not surprised by Essex's rating, because she's a very powerful carrier with a good air complement, and by this stage in the war, we're talking, the spring of 1943 up to the summer, late summer of 1944 is the period covered by the game. The US air crews were very well trained. They were at the very least competent. And those among them who were, better than that were pretty skilled pilots. The Japanese, by contrast, as I'd alluded to earlier, were having serious problems with pilot replacement programs by, 1943. They spent most of 1943 trying to reconstitute their air crews, only to have these men thrown away about a year later at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 1944. So they weren't really in a position to be, they were certainly not a powerful striking force, let me put it that way. So I do raise an eyebrow at Taiho being credited with 4, which is very close to Essex's 5. Now, enough said about the pilots, because that's a bit of a difficult one to quantify, even with a lot of historical and anecdotal evidence. But what did it mean in practical terms? So Essex had a operational design maximum of 91 aircraft. And you can well believe it, because I'm just going to return to the photo I showed us at the very beginning, where, you see Essex's incredibly crowded flight deck. Now, admittedly, that is for aircraft transport, but you can see just how many she's got there. And it nicely illustrates, how easy it was to pack US naval aircraft in that period. Their folding wing designs were very much in advance of what the Japanese were doing. And 91 aircraft is a lot. But more importantly, operationally, she was capable of using nearly all of those. because US aircraft handling techniques were, by this point in the war, better than those of their less well trained Japanese counterparts. So you've got 91 aircraft and the ability to use most of them. Now, comparing this to Taiho, her designed operational maximum is believed to have been about between 80 and 84 aircraft, which is almost as many as the US ship. But, and here's the big but, she was only ever capable, according to some Japanese sources, of operationally employing about 50 to 53, 54 of them, give or take. And that's significantly less than 91. Now, what was going on with all these other aircraft, you may ask? Well, the answer is, unlike the US ship, which could carry all of her aircraft in one piece, admittedly with their wings folded, the Japanese squeezed in those extra airframes, excuse me, by dismantling them. So a fair few of the aircraft she was designed to carry would be dismantled in the lower hangar of the ship. So these were not something you could slap together in an emergency and send off into a battle. So on a good day, Taiho effectively had an air complement at best only two-thirds of the US ships and probably closer to half. So never mind pilot quality, the numbers alone make things problematic for the Japanese. What did these air wings comprise? So for USS Essex, although it varied over time depending on her mission and also the changing nature of her aircrew over the course of the war, in the early part of her career, 36 of these aircraft were fighters, and most of them were the superb F-6F Hellcat. This fighter had been specifically designed to counter the Japanese Navy's Zero fighter. In fact, a lot of analysis had been derived from a Zero which had been captured intact in the Aleutian Islands in 1942. So that the Hellcat was an amazing fighter, and in the hands of skilled pilots, it was deadly. You had 37 of the dive bombers, and these were the SB-2C, which was supposedly an improvement on the Dauntless, and they were tougher, and they could carry a bigger bomb load, but they flew like an absolute brick. And US pilots used to joke that the SB-2C stood for son of a bitch second class. Make what you will of that, but it was a good aircraft. And finally, the remaining 18 were torpedo bombers. So by this stage in the war, the Avenger torpedo bomber, which was a very rugged aircraft, very strong plane, internalized torpedo bay for better aerodynamics, and generally a massive improvement on the earlier TBD Devastator, which had been a bit of a death trap, to be honest. So the US Navy not only rocks up with more planes on the Essex, they have extremely good aircraft, whereas the Japanese, by 1943 into 1944, the Japanese had been developing some new versions of their naval aircraft, but they weren't available in any numbers. So at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Taiho brings a mix of Zero fighters. These are the primary Japanese carrier fighter. And her complement is a bit of a mix. You've got a few of the older A6M2 Zeros, basically what Japan started the war with, up to and including the much improved A6M5. But in real terms, the A6M5's only recommendation is that it's a tougher plane, slightly better built with, I won't really call it armor, it's just a bit more strongly built. But the cost of this is the heavier components actually reduce its performance. So in real terms, the A6M5 is not really that much of an improvement on the old A6M2. And if you're an inexperienced pilot in an A6M, you are not going to be very happy dealing with Hellcats flown by good US pilots. For dive bombers, the Japanese had mainly still the venerable Val dive bomber, again, the aircraft type they'd started the war with. Excuse me, sorry. A very small number of the D4Y Judies, which were a much better dive bomber, had been introduced, but there were not enough of them to really make a difference, and there's that ever-present problem of relatively unskilled pilots. Lastly, the torpedo bombers. Taiho again would have had a fair number of the old B5N Kates, as the Allies called them. There were some of the more modern, improved Tenzan versions coming in, but these were only marginal improvements on the old B5N. So again, you might as well be bringing the same plane to the party, and that plane has passed its sell-by date. So the upshot of all this is I really don't think Taiho deserves a 4. I would not have been surprised if her anti-air rating had been a 2 rather than a 4, because really she was not up to the job. And the same goes with the anti-surface warship rating. I am frankly astounded that she has been given the same rating as the Essex, because she should not be anywhere near that in terms of her ship killing capability. By this stage in the war, that should be a 1, or if you're very generous, a 2. But, you know, this is just my opinion. Anti-submarine, this is probably a tiny bit more accurate. For most of the period covered by this game, Essex's intrinsic anti-submarine strength was actually quite weak. The US was developing better anti-submarine ordnance and aircraft capable of using them effectively for its carriers, but generally speaking, your defense against submarines came from a combination of patrolling aircraft and destroyers. So I think 2 is a fair one. I suppose you want to give the Taiho some limited ability to counter a submarine. Ironic, given how she was actually sunk. But I suppose giving her a 1, it's sort of on the boundary line between generous and, well, maybe more realistically, it could have been a 0. I'll stick with them and go with a 1 for that one. And lastly, there's the anti-ground rating. Now, this is another one I find really astounding. Why does Taiho have a better ground attack rating than Essex? Now, I'm not going to rehash the numbers I've just fed you because, you know, the one thing that was clear from them, if only by inference, is Essex has got more bombers, certainly more bombers that can be used in a ground attack role, and she has better trained crews. So how Taiho is expected to come along and play merry havoc with US Marines or Army units that are ashore on some Japanese territory is a bit beyond me, to be honest. By this stage in the war, I'd actually be fairly adamant that their rating should be a 0, or if you're really, really feeling kind, maybe give them a 1. If anything, those two figures should be reversed. Essex ought to have the 2 and Taiho the 1 at best. In fact, actually, given how much carrier air support was improving, by 1944, Essex probably deserves a 3. But maybe that's being too generous. What about the speed then? Speed and range. Now, I find this one completely fair because both carriers were actually remarkably similar in their capabilities. Essex, as completed, could make and maintain 32 knots easily. In trials, she actually pushed a bit beyond 32 knots, but if you wanted to not overstrain her 4 Westinghouse turbines, then, you know, run her at 32 by all means. Taiho was very, very slightly faster, although you do have to take some of the Japanese accounts with a pinch of salt because they're a bit inconsistent on this point, but the best ones report that she could make and hold 33 knots in all conditions, and she was certainly built for it. Those of you who've seen my previous video will remember I mentioned, and rather weirdly, they give a strange silhouette on the counter. That's not Taiho, not by any stretch of the imagination, but you remember the importance of the hurricane bow, which gave her a good bit of weatherproofing. Unlike other Japanese carriers, this one wouldn't be terribly wet forward, and arguably, in a way, she was almost better than the US carrier in this regard. So, yeah, 33 knots. She also had 4 turbines driving 4 propellers. And both of them, in terms of long-range strategic reach, if they were cruising at between 10 to 15 knots, they could each make an impressive 15,000 nautical miles, give or take. So these were very long-legged ships. So, yes, both of them having the same range rating of 3, I have no quarrel with that whatsoever. So much for what we can see on the counters. I'm just going to end with one more thing before I move away from the counters. And sorry, camera. Now, Essex starts the game in play, unsurprisingly, so she doesn't have a date on the reverse of her counter. The thing that was very curious about Taiho was that until I made my little modification of 1944 there, you can tell it's not printed. That's my horrible scrawl with a red pen. Taiho actually started the game in the starting mix for Japanese forces, which, given that the game starts in October 1943, I find rather interesting. She had a good few months before she was going to commission, so let's see, November, December, January, February, March. The game has her appearing about 5 months before she actually entered service, which shouldn't really happen. So I've taken the liberty of correcting it, and the next time I play this game, she will enter when she's supposed to. Now, you might ask, are they perhaps playing with the history a bit to give the Japanese a bit more of a chance? Is this a what-if scenario? Well, maybe. But I found it significant looking at the other ship counters that every other vessel on both sides either appears at the beginning of the game where they're meant to be, or they appear in their correct year of service. So I'm going to put that one down to an omission, an error. So what have we not covered? Well, I don't want to go into the game's repair charts in any great detail because that would be quite laborious. I have already mentioned that the US ships, on account of their better damage control and toughness, tend to do rather better than their Japanese counterparts when rolling for survival. But is this fair? Can we talk a bit about vessel survivability? Well, we certainly can, yes. So in terms of watertight compartmentalization, and again, we have to be a bit careful because Japanese sources are a bit inconsistent, but the overall impression we have is that because of the interior distribution of space and the priorities given to aircraft handling and other shipboard functions, the Taiho actually had a slight advantage over the Essex in terms of internal subdivision. So she had been inspired, as I'd said in the previous video, in part by what the Japanese knew of the new generation of British armoured carriers that were entering service midway through the war. Now, the Royal Navy made a conscious trade-off in designing its carriers, accepted that they would have relatively low numbers of operational aircraft. But in exchange for that, you get carriers with much greater survivability, and that's survivability across the board. They can resist all but the heaviest aerial bombs. They're built to survive torpedo hits. The British remembered the painful lessons of losses like the Ark Royal. You didn't want that happening again. And in their own fashion, because there was no way they would have had a look inside British carriers, but they could have, they comprehended the theory. The Japanese had worked the same level of survivability into Taiho, so she could stand a bit more flooding than the Essex could because she had a greater number of watertight compartments, and the Japanese just accepted that these would impede some of the carrier's shipborne operations. What about armour protection? So Essex had belt armour. I'll just move the counters so I can get these nice profiles back, because these will make for a handy comparison. Let me pull the camera back so you guys can see. Sorry, counter. Just going to move you. Let's give ourselves a bit more distance. Ah, parfait. So the Essex class had a fairly uniform armour belt running along most of the ship's side, and it was 4 inches at its thickest, tapering to 2.5 inches at the ends. Taiho had appreciably thicker armour. You're looking at about just under 6 inches at its thickest point, but unlike the Essex, it wasn't a continuous or uniform belt. This really thick 6-inch armour for the Japanese was concentrated around the ship's magazines, and it tapered down to 2.5, 2.2 inches of armour over the machinery spaces. So thicker armour than the US ship in terms of absolute plate thickness at its densest point, but still somewhat behind because areas of the ship were left unprotected. The Japanese had an advantage with the flight deck armour, which was somewhat over 3 inches thick. The US ship had no flight deck armour at all. It was just the standard steel plating with the ubiquitous wooden planking on the top. But what the US ship did do was that it had hangar deck armour, so the level directly below the flight deck was protected with 2.5 inches of armour so that it could protect the machinery and the magazines and the vitals of the ship. The Japanese doubled up on their protective system by not only having the flight deck armoured, but the hangar deck, the lower hangar deck level, because she had a 2-story hangar, that was protected by armour which was just under 5 inches thickness. So in terms of resisting bomb hits, the Taiho was a much stronger ship than the Essex. She could probably shrug them off till the cows came home. And like her British counterparts in 1945, she probably could have survived a lot of aerial bombs. Depending on where the hit came, she may also have been able to survive torpedoes. Now, the only other thing I've not talked about is the gun armament of the two ships, because that's an important factor in their anti-aircraft rating, as well as the aeroplanes that they bring to the party. Now, the Essex had a very comprehensive anti-aircraft suit. So she had these twin 5-inch guns that you can see in the gun houses fore and aft of the island. And she also had 4 single 5-inch on the port side in sponson. So you can't see them in this starboard elevation, but they would have been on the other side. In fact, you could see them in the photo I showed you previously. There they are. Those are 2 of the unshielded 5-inch, and she would have had equivalents further aft. Sorry. In addition to that, she had a liberal scattering of quadruple 40mm guns, 8 in all, plus 46 single 20mm mounts, and you can see loads of them along the side of the ship. So when we remember that these were backed up by proximity fuses for the heavier guns and pretty decent air detection and gunnery radar, she could put up a very formidable anti-aircraft defense. The Taiho had much weaker defenses. She had a search radar, but it had no gunnery direction function. And she had 6 of the twin 3.9-inch anti-aircraft guns. So a total of 6. They were in 6 twin mounts, 3 on each side. And she had 51 of the 25mm guns in mountings ranging from singles to triples. Now, the sad news for the Japanese was that none of these weapons were particularly effective at any range, so the anti-aircraft armament overall was unfortunately pretty weak. Lots of sound and fury, but by 1944, they would have found it very difficult to land hits on attacking US aircraft. And even if they did, most of this armament was either too short-ranged, like the 25mm, or simply not powerful enough. There wasn't a big enough concentration of the 3.9-inch guns to really make a difference. And without proximity fuses, their effect was even less than that. So I think that covers the important elements of both of these ships in terms of how they're represented in the game. So just to sum up, I think some decisions in this game design must have been taken for play balance, because when one compares it to the reality of the situation, the Taiho in this game is massively pumped up. And that may be to give the US player a bit of a handful and a bit of a challenge, but really she should not be anywhere near as strong as she's made out to be in the game, especially if you take the figures that they've given Essex as a fair benchmark. And because this game uses six-sided dice, they can't really make Essex much more powerful than that, although she does deserve a better rating there. But I'll leave it there because it has been an interesting portrayal of the two ships, even if Taiho's been turned into a bit of an incredible hulk of an aircraft carrier. I hope you've enjoyed this one as much as I've enjoyed making it. It has actually been great fun researching these two ships and reminding myself why I think they're so awesome. So I hope that you've enjoyed this too. As always, a massive hello and thank you to my long-suffering veterans who are still here and still supporting the channel. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate your company, and it's always good to see you. As ever, to those who might be visiting my channel for the first time, you are more than welcome. I hope you found this video interesting and enjoyable. If it's either of these two amazing carriers or the game Central Pacific campaign that's brought you here, I hope you'll enjoy the other videos that are attached to the series. And if it's wargaming in general that's brought you here, that you're more than welcome. Please have a wander around. I hope you find other videos that you enjoy as well. But I will wrap up here. Thank you all again so much for me, and please feel free to leave comments if you want to. I will try to respond as soon as I can. But in the meantime, I wish you all very well, whoever you are and wherever you're watching from. And I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Thank you very much. Bye.